Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the compliments that you gave me for my last and first visit with you. Um, Trying to think of good subjects to talk about that would be of interest to anybody. And then I thought to myself, well, in those days, there were things that modern day um, civilization has no idea about. And one of them is the effects of a famine and a drought. And when I was a kid, my my dad took me on a day's outing, packed up sandwiches, and took us to the Nairobi Game Park. Now, the game park is a huge, huge area of land, um, protected by what they call daskaris, which are um, guards. But not in that many volume, but just they were available, and they used to drive around in Land Rovers and monitor the park overall in a very, very sort of minimal way. To get into the park, you go through a welcome gate, and you would pay a small subscription, and we would go in. Well, we had packed up sandwiches that day to go pretty much for the day because it's such a big area and it houses just about every kind of African animal you can imagine. The idea being that enclosed within the park, um, they were kind of protected from poachers and outside influences. I'm going to say to drive through the park, it was on a dirt track, and you'd follow the dirt track, and it would go in a somewhat of a circle around the perimeter of the park, but there would be cross streets that would cut you across the park if you wanted to cut your visit shorter, etc. And this was in the period when there had been a 7 year drought. And when I say a 7 year drought, I mean not one drop of rain in 7 years. So you can imagine the devastation that had taken place from the lack of water within the environment that it was. And there was no water replacement program, nothing like that. They just were left to fend for themselves, and the wild animals would just try to be wild animals and survive, which was devastating. I remember as soon as we drove through the gate and entered into the park itself, there were carcasses everywhere. The stench was horrendous, and it was horrendous pretty much throughout the whole environment. But if a father could have given a kid a better training, I can't think of one. I learnt respect for nature. I learnt respect for preservation, for survival, and for the good things that we all live with and have. And it's never left me. Um, to this day, my kids have always joked because I clean my plate. I always do, and I always will. I cannot stand waste of food of any kind, and I just don't believe in it. Anyway, that's diversing, but my point is that these animals had to learn to survive, and many, many, many of them didn't survive. But in amongst them, there were survivors. There were animals that were still walking around and looking very, very weak, malnourished, and obviously dehydrated. And as we went through the park, um, the wildebeest were probably the most memorable because they're a fairly big animal. And when you see one of them just their body just lying on the ground rotting, it really makes you think. But in amongst them, these survivors also, for whatever way, shape, or form, found a way of surviving. And I guess in our society today, it works very similarly. There are the survivors, and there are the ones that don't survive, and that's what filters out the human race as well. I remember as we drove through the park, um, we came across a family of baboons, a big family. There was probably about 15 of them. They were running around, and I guess they'd found a way to eat whatever berries were on the trees, or rummage amongst carcasses. I don't really know how they were surviving, but they were making it work. Um, and at the time, my dad had taken with him a 8mm cine camera. You know, those are the cameras that they used to have where they'd have a spool which you would replace inside the camera, and the spool would be about 25 feet long, and you take a limited amount of video, then replace the spool with a fresh one. And I remember at the time we were driving through the park, and we'd come across this family of baboons in the distance, not that close to us. So he stopped to change the spool on his cine camera. And in those days, we didn't have air conditioning in the old Morris 1000 car. So he had cracked the windows. We'd both, opened them up a bit, and we were looking at the camera and changing it and so on. And as I sat there, I suddenly got a shock. A big baboon had jumped up onto the hood of the car, and he was looking through the windshield, staring at us. Then another one jumped up onto the hood of the car. And of course, my dad was rushing to try and get the camera set up. And while we're sitting there, all of a sudden, an arm comes in through the window. And it's one of these fellas, and he must have climbed up on the roof, and he put his arm in to try and grab whatever he could grab through the window. And I remember getting a really big stir because it was scary. And these guys don't let go when they grab you. And so I remember yelling to my dad, and we we tried to get him out by smacking him with a magazine, a rolled up magazine, to get his hand out so we could close the window manually, crank it up. Took a little while, but eventually we got it cranked up. And so these guys were all climbing all over the car, still thinking they could get in. Well, after they realized that this was not going to happen, baboons have a way of showing their disrespect for you. And so they all decide to urinate all over the hood. And that's their way of telling you, forget you, we're not interested in seeing you anymore. And as they did so, they leapt off the car and ran off into the bush. And it was really an experience I'll never forget, actually. The other experience I will never forget was as we drove through the park. There was a pride of lions, and probably about 6 of them. And they looked so scrawny. They were nothing but skin and bone. And they were lazy because they had no energy and were lying right next to the side of the road, totally disinterested on the fact we were driving through. And I remember looking down at them and feeling so terribly sorry for them, because when you see an animal in that sort of state of um, being run down, it makes you really realize that life is very precious, and you have to appreciate your resources and keep it that way. You've got to look after stuff. Anyway, didn't mean to make you sad, but I wanted to emphasize to you how things like going through a game park in those years ago had such a dramatic effect in my mind over the years of what is important in life. And when you see these tragic stories of the hurricanes and the twisters that have gone through most of the United States, those poor people that suffer from that. What we don't hear about, and very rarely, is you get the news break of how the tornado went going crashing through a township or whatever and destroyed it, left it flat. You get the pictures. The news people are only interested in drama. But what we don't hear about is what happens to the people after this has happened and how long it takes them to rebuild their lives. I mean, I've dealt with many people in my life in the housing industry, being a salesman in the business, and I know that when people buy a house, it's the biggest investment that they ever make, and the concept of replacing that big investment, which mostly was probably bought with borrowed money, is almost a non-issue. And I have always thought that is a huge tragedy that is not really talked about enough. There's not enough help. I know we all want to help and we're all tied up in our busy lives and it's difficult to do that, but there's got to be a way that we can have the ability to jump into action and help people, meaning that we need reserve supplies and reserve temporary housing readily available on all occasions to move in there the minute this happens so that their suffering is minimized. Anyway, that's enough of my little political bit, but just wanted to say that so many things in life have to be valued, and Mother Nature is a force to be reckoned with. None of us have the ability to deal with Mother Nature when she's angry, and it leaves a huge impact on the world when Mother Nature decides to do something tough. I feel like things are in a change right now in the world. We're getting a lot of extra storms and things, and they blame it on human activity. And I'm sure that there is some relevance to that. But the truth is that the world has always been in a cycle of change. Some eras are frozen, some eras are extra hot, and so on. Storms are generated by hot and cold happenings and such. And so, I find it difficult to hold mankind completely to blame. I'm sure we are guilty of impact, but we can't underestimate Mother Nature. And Mother Nature has a course of action that we cannot argue with. And if you look at the mighty God who created this world, it wasn't an accident that this planet was, I'm going to say, as successful as it was from a human point of view, putting so incredible a machine on the planet. Anyway, just want you to all think for a little while about how very, very lucky we all are. Have a lovely day. I'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.